So I figured I'd take the plunge and just put down my thoughts anyway about the Switch 2. Now, if you don't know, the Nintendo Switch 2 is about to come out in about a week and a half, and it was only revealed like a month and a half ago. So like, there's only a 2 month period between like learning about what the console is and the date and it coming out. And I consider a new console in general to be a big deal, especially if it's from Nintendo. And I was all set, after seeing the Direct especially, I was all set on making a big reaction analysis video, something I've never really done before because a new console was never really a thing during my time on YouTube and streaming and stuff, right? Like this is one of the longest console generations ever. But I said this in a previous video, but I've been very apprehensive about doing it because the reaction online in all of the circles that I keep track of have more or less been the complete opposite of what I expected, where instead of people trying to analyze and like take apart what everything means, there's just been this wave of negativity, particularly towards the price of games or just the like Nintendo's overall actions in the corporate world, which kind of frustrated me. And after a lot of self-reflection, I decided that I would just share my take on it anyway, because I might regret it, and it's really one of these rare instances where I can just dump everything that goes through my head when I think about video games. So I'm not gonna. I'll try to insert some imagery as I go in post, and I'll have some chapter markers, but I'll just be going through 6 or 7 different things that kind of stood out to me in Direct, as well as the information that came out in like the weeks or two after. Now, hardware-wise, I could go on a little bit about that, and I actually did, but I think I'm just going to cut out that entire bit because I'm not sure how many people will care about that. It's going to be a new Tegra chip. There's been plenty of leaks about it where it seems to be built on an NVIDIA like 3000 series GPU chip, but it uses parts from later generations, and it's also going to be like 1080p, 120 FPS, um, and yeah, like these are just, most of these things are kind of just bringing it up to like what's most common in homes, or something that's might bring something more unique than playing on a TV. G-Sync in particular is something that's going to be on the screen on the Switch 2, and it won't be outputting G-Sync or VRR to the TV. So apparently Nintendo issued a correction to clarify that it won't be outputting to TVs, but I actually assumed that it wouldn't at all. Those TVs, as far as I'm aware, actually aren't common yet. They're much more common on monitors, like computer monitors, but that's not the expected use case of the Switch 2. So that's probably the main thing I would say when it comes to the hardware. Another thing as well is I did read this interview where Nintendo surveyed game developers on what they wanted on a Joy-Con or on a controller, and they said apparently an overwhelming majority of developers did not actually like analog triggers anymore. And by that I'm referring to the L2 and R2 buttons. Well, on the Xbox you'd call them LT and RT. So that's why they're still not on them this time on the Joy-Con, while the Xbox and PlayStation controllers still do. Now, this does mean that some PlayStation and Xbox games can't be ported to the Switch 2, which limits third-party options, but given that they said an overwhelming majority, or at least a majority of developers didn't like it, I think that says a lot about like how the developer community feels about it overall compared to people who play these games. So it's probably just gonna not have a huge effect. I'm not really sure about that. Now, when it comes to upgrading from the Switch, Nintendo did also talk about these game upgrade packs, where for about probably $10 or something, you'll be able to have a more optimized version of the Switch game with 1080p and 60 support and or 120 FPS support and so on and so forth. And this seems like a bit of a mixed bag, where I did, like straight after the Direct, I did thoroughly read the information on the website, the Nintendo website, and the general takeaway is that anything that costs $10 or so, or anything that any upgrade that costs money, will include DLC as well. So it's really them attempting to frame it as a value-added bonus. There are also plenty of upgrades that are free regardless, but the information was kind of tucked away on the Nintendo website. When I say mixed bag, it really probably has to do with what kind of DLC I'm interested in. For the Zelda games, they have heavy emphasis on a phone navigation app, which is going to be the main bonus. And that's not something I'm probably going to be into. I'm not going up to 4K. I'll still be playing at 1080 anyway. So it seems to be a bit of a mixed bag. Regardless, it's probably going to be loading faster. It depends on how the loading is actually programmed into the game. So if it's actually just uncapped and in memory, it might just load faster regardless because of the faster speeds. But if there's some kind of hard-coded fixed timer in the engine, this is getting into technical game developer stuff. But there might not be an improvement there. There are quite a number of older games that actually have a fixed timer during the loading screen, but that is probably a bit too technical. So one of the main subjects was that seems to be garnering a lot of criticism is the prices of the games and the game console itself. And I've bitten my tongue for a very particular reason, and it's because I don't really believe anything I say will actually convince anyone. And a lot of that comes from the fact that I'm in Australia, and the prices here are fine. Yeah. So there is a price rise in Australia as well. So the MSRP, well, there's a few acronyms for it, but the recommended retail price does have a rise, but Nintendo games for the last 15 to 20 years have actually always been like $20 below PlayStation or Xbox games, and Nintendo has actually kept that generally low here. So like Xbox and PlayStation games have typically been 100 to 110 Australian dollars here, while Nintendo games for the Wii, Wii U, and the Switch have actually been around 70 to $80, and all they're really doing is just raising it up by 20 to this. It's like it's par for the course. So like, yeah, there's really little to no effect on me when it comes to the game prices, and I'm fine with that. So there's also an issue where a lot of stores, like this is the part where you need to shop around, but there are going to be stores that sell slightly above or slightly below the recommended retail price. So it is still a rise, but for the most part, the shops here recognize that they are a bit expensive. We tend to get the short end of the stick, and we have been getting that for the last 20 years. So a lot of stores here actually sell below MSRP by like $5 or $10. So the situation in Australia is completely unchanged. So sucks for you. That said, there are lots of different possibilities on why the rise in price is a thing. And this is probably the most significant subject of the video, to the point where everything before this is probably, just fluff. And I think when I was watching the Direct, there were a lot of clues which led to the idea that game prices would rise. One of the biggest things is the fact that the Switch 2 will actually only accept SD Express cards rather than regular SD cards. And this is actually probably one of the newest forms of technology that the Nintendo Switch 2 will be having, because these are faster versions of SD cards which are fundamentally different from SD cards, to the point where it probably needed a better name, to be honest, rather than SD Express. Another thing that came up in game stores when the store listing started is the idea of a game key card. So there is a prominent banner on the cover saying that it is just a code in a cartridge and you need to download the game. I'm not sure how to explain this succinctly, but the short of it is that CDs have a large capacity, but the disadvantage is that they've always been slower than cartridges. And with the PlayStation 3, this kind of came to a peak where the Blu-ray disc was much slower. Some game developers did their best to optimize their game to load quickly, but in many other cases, you had to install the game, to the point where on the PS4, every single game needs an installation. So when you get your game, you can't just pop it in and play. You need to wait for an hour for it to install. And that means that for around 10 to 15 years now, console gamers have been required to install games if they were on a Sony console or an Xbox console. And Nintendo has actually avoided that the entire time. So I believe they actually went the route of compression and more efficient loading, as well as going with the loading speeds of cartridges, although they were using discs for their home consoles. The cartridges were on the DS and stuff. And I think this is really a convergence of a broad problem where loading speeds are actually our new bottleneck in computer technology, rather than GPU power or RAM or VRAM in memory and stuff like that. It's just the actual throughput of data. And maybe this is going over a lot of people's heads, but this is something that I have slowly noticed for a very long time, where maybe this is just the breaking point, where SDX, like they don't want regular SD cards in the Switch, they want SD Express, and the game cartridge is probably going to be an SD Express derived chip, which means that the cartridge itself, all of that explanation is essentially me saying the cartridge is probably expensive, and that is probably half of the reason of why the price of the game has risen. The other half is probably inflation. So that if you open up an inflation calculator online, put in the price of the Nintendo Switch and put in the year of the Nintendo Switch, so 2017, the price roughly lines up, although there's a slight discrepancy of about $5 or $10. So I think there's the issue of the game price is a very complicated question, where there are probably a lot of factors which led to the price going up. A lot of the complaints I've seen online give a lot of arguments about how development is cheaper now, or Nintendo can afford to sell for less or something like that. But if I was using the data that I had available to me and assumed that Nintendo was just doing a robotic calculation, then there would still be a price rise. So I think the full answer is something that we'll not get, but there are a lot of things that seem to point towards a price rise being required, although the question of how much is probably still debatable. There's probably also a slightly adjacent matter of like the concept of the game key card. And this, I think, relates to how in a lot of games now, the disc is provided when you buy a PS4 or PS5 game, and it actually contains, it is essentially a game key card itself. Like it has a code on it which verifies ownership, and it contains some data for the games for you to install, but you actually need to download the rest. And the game key card, I think, is really Nintendo's way of doing that, possibly because third-party developers asked for it, and essentially doing it in their own way with full disclosure. Because, like the other day, I actually went off and checked the boxes for PS4 games and stuff, and it doesn't actually say that an installation or download is necessary. Like it's not said very prominently at all. There's a very small blurb saying it requires this many gigabytes and that's it. Like it's just an assumption that you do need to install now. And by having it as a big banner saying download is required, it feels like they're following in Sony's footsteps, but with more disclosure. So on the cover. Another thing that I noticed as well, although it's not actually universal yet, is it goes back to the read speeds of a Blu-ray disc. And I punched in some numbers randomly and realized that the read speed of a Blu-ray disc is, at this point, possibly slower than internet download speeds now. So it's not the case in Australia because we still have slow internet for some reason. But in Japan and the US and a bunch of places in Europe, download speeds are incredibly fast. So the idea of not putting any part of the game to install on the cartridge itself may actually be a pragmatic choice of making sure that the game comes to the customer as quickly as possible, because you can just download it. It's just faster than reading from the cartridge, especially if you want to cheap out. Like, I'm sure it was considered to have SD speed cartridges as a game key card or something. But, like, I mean, at this point, I'm just speculating, right? But it kind of comes down to, again, well, is it fast enough? And I don't really have an answer for that. A lot of this is just me looking at the clues and kind of just coming up with my own hypothesis. But overall, that's kind of my feelings on the game price and everything surrounding it. I think there's just a lot of things that point to it. And you can probably see why I didn't really want to talk about it, because I think a lot of people will disagree or just say, oh, you know, Straya, or something like that. It's just Straya, crikey, or something. Yeah. So, I suppose the final question then is, will I get it on launch day? And the fact that I've been on the fence for the last several weeks about it probably says no, although I would really like to get it on launch day. And the thing about a game console is that, like, it's going to be around, you know, like, it's always going to be here. You don't need to get it on launch day. You can get it at a more convenient time, depending on your finances and stuff. There is really no rush, especially since if you wait a couple of years, there's going to be a bigger library. And that's kind of the unique thing with console launches. In many cases, I have not gotten the console on launch. Like, I've lived through, I've said quite early in the beginning, like, I've lived through from the PS1 to now. So that's about 20 to 25 years of video game generations. And in many of those cases, I just waited for a discount bundle, because when a console comes out, well, unless there's a killer game of like one in particular, there's no real reason for me to get one. I have gotten a couple of consoles at launch, but it really just depends. Especially since I've just moved almost permanently to PC gaming now, so I have plenty of games to play. One thing I did look up as well is how common a release date of around June is, and only a couple of other game consoles were actually released around this time of the year. So the first Switch was released in March. It coincided with the release of Zelda Breath of the Wild. But I expect there to be a second wave of game console purchases in the lead up to Christmas, because Christmas is actually the most common time for a game console to release, or at least have a burst of sales. So that's generally where I am with wanting to get the console on release. But I don't really see that as like a serious issue. Like, the Mario Kart World Bundle is going to be available for months afterward. Not sure how long. It says while supplies last or something like that. But I don't really see it as a big deal. It would certainly be nice if I could show it off to you in a couple of weeks. But I don't see it as a priority. And I don't consider that to be a black mark on the console itself. It's well, like I said, Christmas is a big time to get the console, you know? So, yeah. Anyway, so those are all of my thoughts on the Switch 2. It's pretty much just me talking for, what was it? Like, actually, I won't put a time because I'll probably cut it down. So, what is it, like 20 minutes or something? Like, or 30, 40? Just looking at that clock over there. Um, and, yeah, so I'm not really sure how many people will care about this, but it is what it is.